At the bakery, in front of everyone, they shouted at me, "Thief, go away!" I lowered my head and left silently, but what no one imagined is that days later I would be the one to save the life of the owner of that place. That is my story. I was born on the wrong side of town, but that didn't stop me from dreaming right. I always say it wasn't the neighborhood that shaped me. It was hunger. Hunger to belong, to be seen, to prove my name could ring true in ordinary conversation. I grew up amidst sirens and backyard laughter, between impromptu payday parties and long silences when the electricity bill didn't add up. My mother worked in 2 family homes, arriving home with the smell of bleach on her fingers and a stubborn hope in her eyes. My father left early, leaving a yellowed photo and a handful of empty promises. I learned not to expect anything from anyone, and yet I wanted everything. A room of my own, a job that wouldn't end with the first layoff, a surname that wouldn't carry suspicion. Before I was the ex-con, I was Michael, the fixer. I didn't have a degree, but I had patience. I took apart radios, assembled fans, and unclogged pipes when my neighbor knocked on my door. I'd accept a few bucks, sometimes a plate of food, and move on. There was a peace in this work. The screw that goes back into place, the water that runs again, the music that plays again. It was as if, piece by piece, I was also able to fix something inside myself. I had my simple rituals, waking up early, drinking black coffee without sugar, going out with my tool bag, returning in the late afternoon, and sitting on the sidewalk to watch the sky change colors. It was like that for a while. Long enough for me to believe I could live without major tragedies. But life has its twists and turns. A childhood friend, I won't reveal his name, came up with a proposition that seemed too easy. Quick money, clean service, no risk, as he said. I'd heard that song before. At first, I resisted. Necessity, however, has a cruel way of negotiating with conscience. I should have trusted my discomfort, but we did. A wrong delivery. A package that wasn't a package, and suddenly I was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, holding a box worth a prison sentence. The rest is history, a story I don't like to repeat. Sirens, cold handcuffs, a trial that moved faster than my ability to defend myself. I won't romanticize it. I made a mistake. I accepted being there, and the system did what the system does. Time in prison. They say it changes a man. In my case, it split me in 2, the Michael before and the one after. The one before thought he could solve everything with a little courage and improvisation. The one after learned to count steps. I marked days in concrete terms, like someone recording a debt that needed to be paid. There were nights when the noise kept me from thinking, and others when the silence was so heavy it felt like the bed would give way. I survived by creating routines. Push-ups in the morning, reading anything I could get my hands on, writing notes I never sent. I learned to talk less and observe more. Above all, I learned to desire the ordinary, the right to cross the street without someone suspiciously scanning my face, the right to walk into a bakery and choose a loaf of bread by its smell. When I left, I carried a bag of clothes, a crumpled piece of paper with addresses of places that would help me start over, and the decision not to return. The world outside seemed the same, but I had changed scale. Simple things became gigantic. Buying a bus ticket without making a mistake, asking about a job without my voice cracking, looking people in the eye and not ducking at the first sign of judgment. The first room I tidied up was tiny, a bed pushed against the wall, a window that was sticky with mold, a crooked crucifix left by the previous owner. I cleaned more than I slept. It wasn't just dirt. It was the desire to erase my tracks and make way for something new. I got some odd jobs with an old neighborhood electrician. He'd give me a rare but fair smile. Work is work, he'd say, and he didn't ask about the past. I'd thank him silently, like someone receiving a glass of water after crossing the desert. With the first money, I bought my tool bag again. Not the same one, of course, but one that fit over my shoulder with the same familiarity. And I created a small ritual that would become, unbeknownst to me, the symbol of everything I wanted to reclaim. Every Saturday morning, I'd go to the corner to buy bread. The smell of yeast, the melting butter, the paper bag sweating in my hand. It made me feel like I belonged in any everyday life, that my life fit on a table with coffee and warm bread. I had been building this routine delicately, like someone building a house of cards, but the city has its eyes, and people's memories are longer than we imagine. A whisper here, a comment there, and I noticed the stares glued to my back. It wasn't aggressive most of the time. It was a silent surveillance, a constant interrogation. When I entered a store, the security guard followed 2 steps behind. When I offered my services, they asked for references with an emphasis that hurt. Some days I resisted steadfastly, others I went back to my room and stared at the ceiling, repeating to myself that I was more than my mistake. It was during this period that the bakery entered my emotional map. It was 2 blocks from my room, a modest place with a faded sign and a window that was always foggy in the morning. At first, no one knew me. I'd arrive, order 2 loaves of bread and a coffee, pay, say good morning, thank you, and leave. It was a simple sequence I'd memorized like someone learning a prayer. I began to notice the details, the creaking cash register, the old radio playing the same songs over and over, the sweaty baker carrying steaming trays, and the owner, a middle-aged man with slumped shoulders, worried about the gas bill. I liked the way the sun hit the counter at 8 in the morning, creating a golden streak that cut through the grains of sugar like ice on asphalt. There was an innocence in this observation, almost a foolish hope. If I became familiar, maybe they'd accept me. And for a while it worked. The attendant began to acknowledge my request. I got a "Good morning, Michael," and that was enough. Routine gradually restored my sensitivity. I began to dream again of small things, buying a stove for the room, saving money for a used bicycle, maybe one day opening a small maintenance service with a simple sign, "Michael, General Repairs." No grandiose ambitions. I just wanted a life I could afford. But the ex-con's peace is always a tightrope. All it took was someone recognizing me from a place I didn't want to remember. All it took was for the rumor to spread faster than bread bakes, and the atmosphere changed. First, the stares returned to measure my steps. Then came the whispers, and the occasional customer moved away from me at the counter, as if my shadow were contagious. I tried not to react. I paid, smiled briefly, and left. I repeated my mantra, "Keep going, Michael, one day at a time." I believed that if I was consistent, if I kept doing the right thing, people would eventually forget. Meanwhile, outside the bakery, life continued to flow with its difficulties and brief joys. The work with the electrician increased. I installed light fixtures in houses that smelled of new paint and replaced fuses in studio apartments as small as mine. Whenever I received my paycheck, I would stash half of it in an envelope hidden inside my pillow, not out of distrust, but as a promise. This was my possible future, silent proof that time could work in my favor. Sometimes, on warmer nights, I would open the window and let the wind sweep the mold from the wall. I imagined a tomorrow where I wouldn't have to explain my past to achieve a present. I didn't know then that the same bakery that provided me with a temporary sense of normalcy would be the stage for my greatest embarrassment, and later the scene of my turning point. At that moment, all I saw was bread, coffee, and a thread of dignity dripping from the rim of my cup. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a warning of anything. I was just a man trying to reconnect inside, like a crackly radio that, every now and then, finds the right frequency. And it was with this delicacy, with this almost childlike care of someone relearning how to walk, that I approached the day everything collapsed in front of the counter. I tell you this because context is what the world doesn't see. The cry I would soon hear, that "Thief, go away," didn't come out of nowhere. It came like thunder after many days of heavy cloud. And before the storm, I was there, learning to breathe outside the bars. searching for a piece of solid ground in the everyday. If I close my eyes, I can still taste that simple coffee, the bitterness that awakened me to the possibility of starting over. I needed so little to move on. I just needed to be allowed to be ordinary. The memory of that day still burns as if it were yesterday. It was an ordinary morning, the kind where the sky is grey, with no promise of rain or sun. I had already run 2 errands, and with the money in my pocket counted, I decided to stop by the bakery. It was my ritual, my little luxury, my moment to feel that I too was part of the normal flow of life. I walked there with light steps, mentally repeating the routine: order 2 loaves of bread, pay, drink my coffee in silence, and leave. Nothing more. When I opened the door, a familiar smell greeted me. That aroma of rising dough, of bread fresh from the oven. There were only a few people at the counter, a lady browsing the pastry displays, a man hurriedly grabbing coffee to go, and 2 teenagers giggling quietly in the corner. I joined the queue, as usual, nothing different, or so I thought. It was the moment the attendant looked up and recognized me that something changed. She froze, as if swallowing hard. Before she could serve me, a customer behind her, a burly man, perhaps an acquaintance of the owner, looked at me disdainfully and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I know that one. He's a thief. Get out of here. Go away." Time stood still. The words echoed inside me louder than any siren I'd ever heard. Thief! It wasn't just an insult. It was a sentence, a mark I'd been trying to erase, and that there and then, in seconds, was branded again on my forehead. The silence in the bakery weighed like lead. All eyes turned to me. The woman walked away, the teenagers stopped laughing, even the smell of bread seemed to vanish from the air. I tried to answer, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat closed. My hand trembled inside my pocket, where I held the coins to pay. I wanted to say that I wasn't that man anymore, that I was trying to start over, that I just wanted to buy bread like everyone else there. But how could I explain that in seconds, before so many eyes that had already decided who I was? The bakery owner came forward, visibly uncomfortable. He didn't actually expel me with his own words, but his gesture was clear. He raised his hand, asking me to leave, as if warding off a problem before it grows. There was no anger in his gaze, only fear. And that fear hurt more than if he had insulted me, because fear can't be argued with, fear can't be convinced, fear simply expels. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my dignity. I put the coins back in my pocket, took 2 steps back, and left. Behind me, I heard the voice repeating, "Thief! This is no place for you!" Outside, the world seemed the same. Cars passing, people crossing the street, the wind stirring the tree branches. But inside me, something had broken. I walked aimlessly for a few minutes, as if needing to dissolve my shame on the asphalt. My heart was pounding, my face was burning, my eyes were watering. I wanted to disappear. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. I'd heard it before, inside and outside the bars. The worst part was the way everyone looked at me, as if suddenly I was no longer human, but merely a walking threat. No one asked, no one wanted to hear my side of the story. One word, thief, was enough for the sentence to be handed down, and in that moment I felt like I was back at the bottom of the cell, with no right to a defense, no right to a future. I returned to my room and sat on the bed. I took the coins from my pocket and stared at them. They were just coins, but they represented my honest effort, my day's work. At the bakery, however, they were nothing more than evidence that I must be stealing again. That's how I felt. I wanted to scream, to explain that the money had come from sweat, that I was trying, that I deserved a second chance. But there was no one to scream to. The moldy walls didn't respond. I spent the night turning the scene over in my mind, every detail, the tone of voice, the owner's gesture, the heavy gazes. It was like an open wound I kept picking at. In the middle of the night, I found myself wondering if I wasn't truly condemned to carry this label forever. Would no matter what I did, they'd always see me as the same man I was before? Was my attempt at change just a pretty but futile illusion? The next day, I was afraid to go out. Afraid that people on the street had heard the story. Afraid of running into someone from the bakery. Afraid of new eyes. My stomach growled, but I didn't have the courage to buy bread anywhere. It was as if every bakery in the neighborhood had closed its doors to me. I chewed on a piece of stale bread I'd saved and swallowed it with a taste of humiliation. The wound wasn't just in what happened, but in what it awakened within me. I felt the weight of the word prisoner again, like a chain around my ankles. I remembered all the times I'd seen men leave prison, full of hope, and return months later, defeated by society's gaze. I didn't want to be one of them, but that day I understood why so many gave up. Rejection is an invisible prison without bars, but one that suffocates more than the cell itself. I tried to rationalize. I thought, it was just one customer who recognized me. That doesn't mean everyone thinks the same. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. If one person screamed, how many others would whisper? If the bakery owner pushed me away in fear, how many other business owners would do the same? The wound was deep, because it showed me that I might be condemned to live forever outside the doors, never inside. And worst of all, I had no way to prove I was different. How could I prove change? The good we do rarely makes the news. Evil, however old, sticks forever. I could work honestly for 10 years, and still, one dirty look would be all it took for everything to crumble. That night, lying in bed, I closed my eyes and heard the voice again. Thief, go away. It was as if it echoed inside my head, louder than the silence, louder than the noise of the city. I had no way to keep quiet. I had no way to defend myself, and perhaps what hurt most was knowing that deep down, they weren't entirely wrong. I had been a thief once. But I didn't want to be just that. I wanted to be Michael, just Michael. That was the first deep cut in my life in freedom. Not blood, not a knife, not a cell, but words. Words that strip away the little dignity we try to rebuild. Words that stick to our skin like an invisible scar. I understood that morning that the struggle outside prison could be even more cruel than the one inside. Because inside, at least, everyone had already been judged. Out here, the trial never ends. After that day at the bakery, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the shame of the moment, but the certainty that the past wasn't buried. I tried to convince myself that it had been just an isolated incident, a misperception, an unfortunate coincidence, but it didn't take long for me to realize otherwise. What I experienced at that counter was just the first crack in a wall that would soon begin to crumble around me. The following week, I returned to work with the electrician. He was a man of few words, but attentive. As he handed me tools, I noticed he was watching me with a different look, as if he'd heard something about me. I wanted to ask, but I kept quiet. Silence is sometimes the only weapon we have to keep from revealing the pain we carry. We finished the job in a small house, and when we left, the homeowner shook the electrician's hand and thanked him, but he didn't offer me anything. He just looked me up and down and turned away. I pretended not to notice, but deep down, that gesture felt like another blow to the wall. Little by little, I realized that distrust was everywhere. At the corner store, the owner began to watch me between the shelves, as if I were about to stuff my pockets with groceries at any moment. At the bus stop, a man whispered something to his wife as I approached, and her eyes flicked over me with disgust. It was as if an invisible shadow followed me, shouting to everyone, "He's not trustworthy. He's made mistakes before. He could make them again." Every time this happened, I remembered the bakery. That scene seemed to repeat itself in new settings, in different voices, but with the same sentence. I started avoiding leaving the house during busy times. I learned to walk with my eyes fixed on the ground, so as not to catch glances that would pierce me like knives. Even the tool bag, which had once been a symbol of my new beginning, began to weigh like handcuffs. I carried it, but I was afraid someone would think I was using it to break down doors instead of fixing light bulbs. And yet, I needed to survive. I continued to accept odd jobs, even when the pay was less than promised. Often, I swallowed my pride and accepted veiled humiliations just to keep up with the little work that came my way. Some people hired me, but made a point of making it clear, "I trust you, okay?" I smiled and thanked them, but inside, I burned. That phrase wasn't trust, it was a threat, and I knew it. The worst part, however, was when I realized the bakery story had spread farther than I'd imagined. One day, on my way home from work, I heard two teenagers whispering as they followed me with their eyes. One of them said, "Look, it's that thief from the bakery." The other laughed. They knew nothing about my life, had seen nothing but a rumor, but they were already certain who I was. Public humiliation had become part of my identity. With each step, I felt like I was walking through a maze with no way out. The outside world told me I should reintegrate, work, be useful, but the same world closed its doors and pushed me back into the dark corner. I wondered how many more would have the courage to resist. How many more would bear this burden without giving in? It's no wonder so many return to crime. Sometimes it's the only way to stop being humiliated. Not because they want to, but because they grow tired of being treated as if they were already guilty again. Back then, my room became both a refuge and a prison. I would spend hours lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand when everything in my life had turned against me. Food was scarce, the refrigerator made an annoying noise, and the mold on the wall seemed to grow worse every day. Sometimes I would sit by the window, watching people pass by, laughing, carrying shopping bags, living the life I could only imagine. I felt outside of everything, outside of society, outside of hope. But it wasn't just isolation, it was injustice. Because I knew I was trying. I knew every penny in my pocket was honestly earned. I knew I hadn't stolen anything, that I hadn't cheated anyone. I had made mistakes in the past, yes, but I was paying for that mistake every day. And it seemed like it would never be enough. The bakery wound gave way to other pains. I began to question even my few ties. Did the electrician trust me, or was he just using me because he needed cheap help? Did any of the neighbors believe I was changing, or did they all just tolerate my presence, waiting for the next slip-up? Even the children playing in the street, when they looked at me, made me wonder, had their parents already told them to stay away from me? I began to lose sleep. Nights became long conversations with myself. I repeated phrases to try to convince myself, "You're not that man anymore. You have the right to change. You deserve a second chance." But deep down, an insistent voice whispered, "They'll never forget. You'll always be a thief, always." And the conflict deepened. It wasn't just me against society, it was me against myself. Part of me wanted to give up, throw everything away, and go back to being who they said I was. After all, why fight an image that was already formed? But there was another part of me, small, resilient, that still believed I could win. This part was stubborn, but it was growing weaker in the face of so much rejection. It was during this period that I began to avoid the bakery altogether. I'd change sides of the street just to avoid passing by. I couldn't bear to see the window, to remember the shame. But ironically, it was as if the place remained present on every corner, as if that "thief, go away" echoed in every room I entered. I didn't need to be there to feel the same pain. The conflict within me was like two opposing forces pulling in different directions. One said, "Prove them wrong. Keep going, fight, show that you've changed." The other said, "Accept it. They will never forgive you. They will never forget. You have no future here." And with each humiliation, the second voice grew louder, more convincing. It was then that I realized the world didn't need to physically beat me. The words, the looks, the gestures were already keeping me trapped. It was a prison without bars, but with invisible walls as high as those of the penitentiary. I was free, but not free, and that, I confess, hurt more than any cold cell. I was faced with a silent choice. Resist, even as I bled inside, or give in and become what everyone believed I was, and at that time I wasn't sure which side would win. One day I woke up with a strange feeling. It wasn't just tiredness, it was a weariness that came from my soul, an ancient fatigue that seemed to have pulled everything down. I got up, looked around the tiny room and felt the heaviness in the air. Life hadn't just closed doors, it felt like it was ripping out the windows too. The bills were piling up, my cell phone rang without an answer from my boss, and I had less work than I'd expected. It was as if the whole world had agreed not to offer me anything. That week, the electrician asked me to stay home. "You owe me some materials, Michael. When I get them, I'll let you know." He said it like that, dryly. There was no explanation, no empathy, just economy. I understood. For those hiring, trusting someone with my past is a risk few are willing to take when their wallets are tight. I left his house empty-handed and with a suffocating feeling in my chest, as if the air had less oxygen when you needed it most. I returned to my room and found a letter under the door. It was from the building's landlord, a rent increase, or if I preferred, I could move out in 30 days. It dulled the pain like a punch. I looked at my things, 2 boxes, the tool bag, a mattress, and felt the floor give way. That room was my little universe. Losing it was losing the last proof that I was trying. Desperation has a voice louder than any reason. What did you do wrong to deserve this? I searched for solutions. I strode around the neighborhood offering services, carrying the shame of asking for work. I asked for help from a distant cousin who, when I showed up at the door, looked at me with pity and said he could lend me $50, but he needed the money back the following week. I accepted, but when I went to collect the money, he had already spent it on another emergency. The help evaporated. Life then showed me that when the tide goes out, so does solidarity. On a rainy afternoon, with no work, no comfort, no expectations, my cell phone pinged with a message. The name of my old friend. That old friendship that had led me astray returned, and with it, the offer I'd feared most. "I have a plan. Quick, I need you. 2 days and everything's set." For a moment I felt my hands tremble. The old temptation was as familiar as an old blanket. Warm, practical, able to ward off the immediate chill. I thought about the bills, the rent, the landlord's face demanding payment. I thought about the mold on the walls, the thin mattress. I sat, staring at the message, like someone staring into an abyss. My mind did quick calculations. In 2 nights I could pay the rent, maybe even save some money. My conscience, that voice I'd been training to protect me, whispered, "No, Michael, it's not worth it. You already know the end." But the voice of hunger, of need, was louder. I began to imagine an immediate future, money in my pocket, temporary peace. I spent hours mentally taking inventory of what I would lose if I took this step. I would lose more than physical freedom. I would lose the last line of credit I had with my own morals. If I messed up again, there would be no more room. I thought about the bakery attendant's eyes, the owner's gesture that had pushed me away. I thought about how, in that very bakery, the humiliation had materialized in a public outcry. And at the same time, I thought about the coldness of the rent coming, the possibility of turning upside down with nowhere to go. That night, I walked aimlessly. The rain seemed to wash something away, but it didn't reach my chest. I stopped at a bus stop and sat down. A couple passed me by, without noticing my presence. I was invisible again, but invisibility hurt because it was rejection, not freedom. It was there, in that silent wait, that I felt the moment of rupture approaching. It was as if my life was hanging by a thread and someone was starting to cut it. I received another message. "We'll meet at the corner of the market at 11 p.m. Don't talk to anyone." I could have said no, turned off the phone, gone to sleep, and woke up with the sun. But the immediate demands of the world, pay, eat, don't freeze to death, weighed more heavily. I said yes. The answer came out short, swallowed. Throughout the day, I tried to rationalize. I did small tasks, fixed an outlet for a neighbor, changed a light switch at the little bar on the corner, and saved up coins. It was not much. I sat on the sidewalk with my little hands covered in grease and thought about my mother. I thought about the sacrifices she made, the smell of bleach when she came home from work. I remembered the look in her eyes when I was a child, the silent promise I'd made that I wouldn't be like the guys I saw on the street. And the weight of that promise crushed me. That night I walked to the corner. The nocturnal world has a raw quality that reveals who we are in the dark. My friend appeared with two others. There was a tension in the air, that mix of adrenaline and danger you feel before a decision that could scar you for the rest of your life. The second I approached, I saw the gun strapped to one of the guy's waistband. A chill ran down my spine. I knew instantly that if I gave in to that mindset, there would be no turning back. I stood there, my body trembling, and felt the moment of rupture become a trigger. Memories of the cell, of the false nights of power, and of the betrayals began to appear like a sped-up film. And for some reason, it was as if a mirror were pointed at me. I saw a man smaller than I wanted to be. Before I could decide anything, I reached into my pocket and found the small wallet with a few dollars, the fruit of the day's odd jobs. It wasn't enough for rent, but it was enough to buy a bus ticket out of town if I wanted to disappear. The idea of disappearing was as tempting as the feeling of easy money. Yet at that moment, something surprised me. A different silence came over me. Not the silence of resignation, but the silence of someone recovering. I remembered the baker's sweat, the bakery owner's face when he thanked me for weeks later, helping to pick up a box that had fallen on the street. A small gesture I'd made without expecting anything. I remembered the radio I'd fixed for my neighbor and the shy smile she gave me. I remembered that despite everything, I still held pieces of a man who wanted to be better. I stood still. My friend called me again. I said no. The word came out dry, definitive. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of pride, maybe out of some fiber that still remained intact. They shrugged, a sneer curling their lips, and left. I remained alone on the corner, under the cold light of the street lamp, feeling the tremor slowly subside. That night I returned to my room exhausted, but aware that something had changed. He hadn't solved the rent problem, healed the wounds, or erased the humiliations. But I had resisted the impulse that could have sent me back to the worst day of my life. The breakup, which had seemed inevitable, was suspended. I knew I hadn't overcome everything. I'd just bought myself time. But for the first time since leaving prison, I felt I still had a choice within me. When I lay down, my body ached and my soul weary. I thought the moment of rupture had shown me who I truly was, when no one else believed it. And although the night closed with the same uncertainty, there was a glimmer of light. I had said no, when everything around me said yes. Some things in life arrive like a gentle breath that we barely feel, until suddenly that breath turns into a wind and pushes us forward. The sign of hope I was hoping for didn't come in the form of a fat check or a promise of a steady job. It came small, strange, and almost humiliating to accept at first. A door left ajar where I'd already imagined doors closed forever. It was a Monday morning. The city was waking up slowly, and I was crossing the street with my tool bag, emptier than usual. My head was full of bills, and I had a strong desire to pretend everything was fine. I passed by the bakery because habit has the power of religion, and out of inertia, I ended up going in. I didn't have the courage to stay long. I just wanted to smell the bread, to remember that there was something ordinary and beautiful in the world. When the attendant saw me, her face still held a rigidity that I knew wasn't coming from me alone. There was a residue from the screaming incident, caution, distrust, the quick retreat everyone makes when they don't want to commit to something uncomfortable. I stood in the corner, scanning the shelves, feigning interest in the cakes. The owner stood behind the counter, frowning, fiddling with a bill. He looked more tired than the last time I'd seen him. There was a slight hint of concern in the way he rested his hands on the table, as if his knuckles were aching. Without planning, I approached. I said nothing. I observed the oven, which for days had been making a strange sound, a metallic clang, a clicking sound that indicated something needed adjusting. I knew the basics of ovens. I'd worked on larger appliances when I worked as an electrician. It was simple. Maybe a loose set of screws, a wire that needed realigning. Deep down, I wanted to help, but part of me calculated the risk. What if I got too close and the owner asked me to leave? What if the attendant cut me off with a look? I took a deep breath and carefully offered, "I can take a look at the oven if you'd like." It was a small sentence, but I felt the weight of it slipping down my throat. The owner looked up slowly. There was surprise there, the same surprise of realizing that someone determined to change isn't also a danger. He didn't say much, just nodded, almost yes. He asked me to stand behind the counter where no one else was, and there I began to work. There was no audience, no applause. Just the sound of my hands, the screw tightening, the connections reconnecting, and the gentle hum of the oven returning to its proper rhythm. As I tinkered, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clean, direct, unvarnished usefulness. It was almost a physical translation of what I'd been trying to do within myself, to fix, to adjust, to restore normal functioning. When the oven cycled normally, the owner gave a small smile, the kind that doesn't come easily, as if he'd validated something more than just a device. He took me aside and said a few words. They weren't grandiose declarations, nor were they an apology for the previous incident. It was a practical gesture. "If you'd like, bring your services when needed. I can pay you in supplies now until things are fixed." He offered a bag of bread, a cup of coffee, and the option of occasionally calling me for small repairs. The smell of warm bread in that package pierced me more than any conversation. It was food, yes, but it was also recognition translated into a gesture, recognition that came from someone who, in that community, held some authority. I accepted the coffee, I accepted the bag, I accepted the deal that wasn't a job, but it was a concrete start. I returned to my room that afternoon with a calmer stomach and grease-stained hands, but with something different, a feeling that perhaps I wasn't as buried by the past as I thought. The owner's gesture didn't erase the wound of the scream. It didn't change the looks in the other stores, but it gave me something I needed more, practical proof that I could be useful and accepted in small spaces. Over the next few days, I showed up more often. I didn't always need to be called. Sometimes I'd bring a small tool and offer a routine check. I fixed the bakery's radio, fixed a shelf that sagged when they stacked boxes, small things no one noticed, but which made the work less arduous. Each gesture like this put me in contact with faces that didn't just see me as a problem. The cashier started greeting me without hesitation, and the baker, without fuss, started opening the door for me when I entered. The sign of hope also came from within. I noticed a subtle change in my posture, less fear of talking to people, less of an immediate urge to lower my head when someone stared at me. It was as if small adjustments in the outside world mended internal fissures. I felt more whole when I fixed a lock. I felt smaller when I remembered the rumor, but I had more resilience to not let one episode define my entire routine. At the same time, it wasn't magic. There were days when distrust resurfaced with a vengeance. You could see it in a shell around people's eyes, in a customer who changed lines upon seeing me. I learned not to be fooled by isolated gestures, but I also didn't refuse what was offered. Hope, for me, was practical. A coffee, a tune-up of the oven, a chance to show off my skills. It was the opportunity to build my reputation little by little, piece by piece, so that the rumor would fade in the face of repeated events. And there was another element. I started hearing stories. Between one repair and another, the owner told me, without much detail, that the bakery was struggling because of the price of gas, that the neighborhood was changing, that he trusted people who helped him without asking for favors. These small conversations put me in a new position, no longer just someone who asked for things, but someone who contributed. This fueled a quiet transformation, not a theatrical redemption, but a daily traction. That week, I wrote a short list of goals on a piece of paper. Pay rent. Save $100. Don't accept scams. It seemed ridiculous, almost childish, but it was the first concrete plan I'd made since leaving prison. This sign of hope didn't catapult my life out of the mire. It merely lit a candle in a dark room. But for someone who spent many years in prison, a candle is the beginning of a beacon. And I needed that beacon. I needed to believe that we can rebuild reputations with repeated work, that the act of fixing an oven can also mean fixing a life. I thought, for the first time in a long time, that maybe I could rewrite my name on a small sign in the future, Michael, General Repairs. It wasn't a grand ambition, it was a humble desire for continuity. The sign of hope gave me room to breathe. It didn't erase my fear, but it made me feel like there were choices available. It was the encouragement that kept me from accepting the easy offer on the corner, and the reminder that sometimes the path is made up of small victories that no one applauds, but that together change the course of life. Every life has a turning point, even if the road always seems straight. My turning point wasn't planned, it didn't come with a warning. It came suddenly, like a shock, in the very place where I had been expelled, humiliated, and stamped with the word that hurt the most: burglar. It was a muggy afternoon, the kind when the air feels heavy and your body groans. I'd spent the morning fixing an electrical system in a suburban house and was returning with my hands still covered in grease. I passed the bakery, intending to just grab a coffee and go. I went in. Everything seemed normal. People picking up bread, the cashier rushing back and forth, the owner behind the counter, his expression weary. I no longer entered with as much fear as before. The wound of humiliation was still there, but the small jobs I'd been doing for the owner had given me a shell of resilience. I was no longer just the ex-con. I was, for some there, the man who fixed things when they broke, and that made a difference. But that day, the difference would be proven in a way I couldn't have imagined. Suddenly, the bakery door burst open. Two men rushed in, hooded and nervous. The atmosphere changed instantly. The customers froze. The attendant dropped the tray she was carrying. The owner paled. I noticed one of the men move quickly, his hand slipping inside his coat. My heart raced. I'd seen this scene before, in other contexts. I didn't need any further clues to understand. It was a robbery. The tallest one pulled out his gun and shouted, "Everyone quiet! Hands up!" His voice echoed in the small bakery space, cutting the air violently. There was absolute silence, except for the sobs of a child with his mother. The second robber ran to the counter, roughly shoved the owner, and demanded that he open the register. At that moment, something ignited inside me. It was as if all the stares, all the distrust, all the humiliation I had carried up until that point condensed into a decision. I could retreat, hide like the others, let fear guide my steps, or I could act. I didn't think much. It was instinct. When the shorter robber turned his back for a second, I lunged at him. The tool bag hit the floor with a crash, and I grabbed his arm with all my strength. The impact was violent. He tried to fight back, but surprise gave me the upper hand. The gun fired a shot that hit the ceiling, sending plaster sparks flying. Panic intensified. The second robber tried to separate me, but the bakery owner, in an unexpected act of courage, grabbed his back. The scene descended into chaos. Screams, struggles, the sound of falling objects. I felt every muscle in my body burning with exertion, my heart pounding as if it were about to explode. Fighting someone armed wasn't just strength, it was desperation. I managed to knock the first one to the ground and kick the gun away. He was kicking and spitting profanities, but I pinned him down with my weight. The second one was still fighting with the owner, but the commotion caused the gun to slip from his hand as well. The attendant, in an act of bravery, ran over and kicked the gun under a shelf. The noise drew attention on the street. Someone shouted for help. The scene seemed to last hours, but it was only minutes before the sound of sirens filled the air. Police rushed in, guns drawn, and quickly subdued the two robbers. When silence returned, I was sweaty, panting, my body trembling. I looked around. The customers were staring at me, but not with that look of suspicion I knew so well. It was a different look, a mixture of shock, respect, maybe even gratitude. The bakery owner was looking at me like someone who's just changed the course of a story, and it was there, in that moment, that the turning point happened. Because I realized I was no longer just the ex-con. It wasn't the label they'd given me the day of the scream. I had proven, not with words but with actions, that I was more. The police officers asked me what had happened, took down my name, my version of events. One of them even said, "You prevented a tragedy." I don't remember answering anything. My mind was confused, still trying to process. But deep down, a small flame lit. Maybe finally I had a real chance to change the way the world viewed me. That day, when I left the bakery, my legs shaking, my face sweaty, I felt something different in the air. People looked at me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. No one called me a thief. No one turned away. I was the same Michael as before, with the same scars, but now I also carried the weight of a gesture that spoke louder than my past. The turning point wasn't just in the eyes of others. It was within me, because for the first time since leaving prison, I felt truly free. Not free because I was out of prison, but free because I had proven to myself that I could be different. I had made the right decision at the riskiest moment, and no one could take that away from me. I returned to my room with my body aching, but my soul light. The mold on the walls was still there, the rent was still a problem, the future was still uncertain. But I carried something new, the certainty that history could change. And that day, silently, I realized that life had given me a new chance. The turning point had begun. I thought the turning point had come that day of the robbery, that the fantasy of having helped save the bakery would be enough to change the way everyone saw me. But the truth is, life never gives everything at once. It gives crumbs, tests, new trials. And soon after that chaotic afternoon, I discovered there was still a confrontation to be faced, not against hooded men, but against something much deeper, the ghosts of my past and the gaze of the community itself. In the days following the robbery, I became the talk of the neighborhood. Some people stopped me on the street to comment. Others just whispered. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do. Some said, "Michael faced 2 armed men alone." Others exaggerated. He saved everyone, otherwise it would have turned into a massacre. And of course there were those who doubted it was luck. I bet he staged the situation himself to come out a hero. This last version hurt the most, because this was exactly what I'd feared all along, that my past would always be used against me no matter what I did. The bakery owner, on the other hand, had changed his stance. The next day, when I came in for coffee, he made a point of calling me behind the counter. He shook my hand in front of everyone and said loudly, "This man here saved me. If it weren't for him, I might not be here anymore." The entire bakery heard it. There was a heavy silence, then a murmur, and I noticed something different in people's eyes. There was still distrust, yes, but mixed with respect. It was no longer the look that said, "Watch out, it's a thief." It was the look that said, "Maybe we misjudged." But not everyone accepted this. At that very moment, that corpulent man, the same one who had once shouted burglar in front of everyone, he raised his voice again. "You saved me because you're experienced. No wonder I knew how to deal with bums. A wolf doesn't turn into a lamb. Sooner or later it'll show its claws." His words cut like a knife. I felt my blood boil, the urge to respond in kind. The bakery owner tried to intervene, but the confrontation was already set. All the customers were looking at me, waiting for my reaction. I took a deep breath. I knew this was the decisive moment. If I lost my temper, I would confirm everything they said about me. If I remained silent, I might be seen as a coward. Then, for the first time in a long time, I spoke firmly. It's true. I made mistakes in the past. I paid for what I did, and no one needs to remind me of that, because I remember it every day. But yesterday I had a choice. I could have run away like anyone would. I could have let the owner here die alone. I didn't. You know why? Because I'm not the same man anymore, and if you can't see that, it's not my problem. The entire bakery fell silent. The burly man blushed, opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't. Perhaps because he himself had felt the weight of the truth. The owner then added, "Michael doesn't owe me anything. I owe him." From that day on, I realized my confrontation wasn't just with that man or the rumors. It was with myself. It was about proving with every gesture that I could be different. And this confrontation isn't won all at once. It's daily, constant, silent. Some still whispered behind my back, but it no longer held the same force. The act of assault had given me something I hadn't had before. A voice. I could respond. I could defend myself. I was no longer just the silent ex-con who lowered his head. I was someone who had shown, at the risk of his life, that I deserved respect. But the biggest confrontation was yet to come. 2 weeks later, a police officer visited my room. He wanted my formal statement about the robbery. I sat before him, nervous, and answered each question clearly. In the end, he said, "You know, Michael, I already arrested you once. I never imagined seeing you like this." That hit me hard. It wasn't an accusation, nor a compliment. It was an observation. I looked him in the eye and replied, "Neither did I imagine. But life gives you choices, and this time I chose right." He was silent for a few seconds, then closed his notebook and left. When the door closed, I took a deep breath. That was it. Life was giving me a second chance, but I had to fight for it every day. The confrontation wasn't just with others, but with the memory of my own shame. Every time I passed the bakery, I remembered the shout, "Thief, go away!" It still hurt, still burned. But now, along with that memory, came another. The owner squeezing my hand and loudly telling me I'd saved his life. It was as if two voices were fighting inside me, and I had to choose which one to give more space to. I chose the second one. From then on, every service I performed, every small helping hand, every glance I won was part of my personal confrontation with the past. It wasn't a glamorous battle with applause and medals. It was sweaty, silent, and at times thankless. But it was mine, and in that process, I discovered that the biggest challenge wasn't against those who called me a thief. It was against the risk of me believing that again. Life has a curious way of weaving stories together. The same neighborhood that rejected me, that branded me a thief, now began to whisper my name in a different way. There were still looks of distrust, of course. But along with them, respect, almost admiration, also emerged. And it was in this scenario that redemption began to take shape, not like a bolt of lightning from the sky, but like a fine rain, slowly wetting until it soaked the ground. The first change came from the bakery itself. After the robbery, the owner began calling me frequently for small repairs. I fixed doors, fixed outlets, and repaired shelves. He always paid me, sometimes in cash, sometimes in bread, coffee, or leftover food. For me, it wasn't a handout. It was recognition. Each task I completed was a way of showing that I was valuable, that I could contribute. Over time, customers began to notice. Those who had previously looked away now greeted me with a shy wave. The lady who had previously shied away from me in fear one day handed me her broken radio and asked if I could fix it. I did it in 2 days and returned it working. When she turned it on and the music started playing again, I saw tears in her eyes. "Thank you, my son," she said. It was simple, but to me it felt like absolution. And then something I never expected happened. The burly man, the one who had humiliated me, who had shouted "thief" in front of everyone, passed by me one morning and, to my surprise, didn't look away. He stared at me. I stared back, ready for another provocation, but instead he just lowered his head and walked away. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything. But in that silence, there was something that meant more to me than any words, the recognition that he was wrong. This was my poetic revenge. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to exact revenge with the same weapons. I simply lived, resisted, and showed that I could be different. Life took care of putting the pieces in place. The man who once branded me a thief now had to see me as a hero, or at least as someone who had done what he wouldn't have dared to do. The police also came back to see me, this time not to investigate, but to thank me. My statement helped lead to the final arrest of the two robbers. One of the officers, the same one who had seen me behind bars years before, shook my hand and said, "Keep it up, Michael. You've shown that change is possible." These words resonated with me in a different way. It was as if the system that had once swallowed me was now admitting that I could start over. But redemption didn't come from outside. It began within. For the first time, I stopped seeing myself as a walking failure. I began to believe that my efforts had meaning. Every honest service I performed, every small victory, was a building block in the reconstruction of my life. I no longer lived just to prove to others. I lived to prove to myself that I could be better. With the little money I saved, I bought a used bicycle. For many, it was just a bicycle. For me, it was a symbol of freedom. I could get to work faster. I could carry tools more easily. I could feel the wind on my face without needing a bus ticket. It was a small step, but it was my step. And it was while riding that bike that one day, weeks after the robbery, I passed by the bakery again and saw a scene that struck me. The same burly man who had once yelled at me was sitting alone at a table drinking coffee. When he saw me, he hesitated, but this time he didn't look away. On the contrary, he raised his hand and waved shyly, almost embarrassed. I didn't respond angrily. I didn't return the humiliation. I just waved back and continued on, because I understood that my revenge had already been achieved, not in shouting, not in force, but in change. He who had called me a thief now had to swallow me as an example of courage. This was true poetic justice, not destroying the other, but forcing them to see who you truly are. And every time I returned to the bakery, I felt this transformation. That place, which had been the scene of my greatest shame, was now also the stage of my redemption. The same counter where I was kicked out was the one where I was invited to have coffee without paying as a thank you. The same space where I heard "go away" was now the space where I heard "thank you, Michael." I realized that life didn't give me a medal, didn't applaud me in public, but it did give me something better. The opportunity to rebuild my dignity, and this dignity, hard won, is worth more than any superficial recognition. My redemption wasn't grand. It was made up of small gestures: the clerk's smile, the owner's confidence, the heavy-set man's silence, the police officer's handshake, the music coming back on the ladies' radio. Each detail was a scar becoming proof of my endurance. And deep down, that was my greatest poetic revenge, to show that despite everything, despite the looks, despite the accusations, I could still write my own ending. Closing my eyes and thinking about everything I've experienced since leaving prison until that day is like watching a film that changes tone with each scene. It started out dark, full of stern looks, cutting words, and doors slammed in my face. There were times when I even believed there was no way out, that my entire life would just be a repetition of the mistake I'd already made. But little by little, small signs began to show me that the past doesn't always decide the future. And when the unexpected robbery happened, my life took on a new shape. Looking back today, I realized that the greatest prison wasn't the one with iron bars and high walls. It was the invisible prison of the looks, the words, the labels that followed me when I returned to the streets. This prison is harder to break because it's in the minds of others. and often in our own. I'd look in the mirror and see only the thief, not the man I wanted to be. But something changed, and it wasn't all at once. It wasn't magic. It was small, hesitant, sometimes painful steps. Every time I fixed something at the bakery, every time I received a sincere thank you, every time I managed to resist the temptation to give up, I placed another obstacle in the path of my own freedom. The confrontation with that burly man, the same one who humiliated me, was a turning point. When he fell silent, when he couldn't attack me after I spoke firmly, I realized I no longer needed to shout to prove who I was. I just had to live. Life would show me, and it did. My redemption wasn't gaining fame or wealth. There were no spotlights, interviews, or public applause. My redemption was simple and quiet. Being able to walk into the bakery without fear, being able to look people in the eye without lowering my head, being able to sleep at night with a clear conscience, knowing I had chosen right. The bakery owner became a friend, someone who trusted me. He would sometimes call me to chat after work, offer me coffee and listen to me. He once told me, "Michael, at first I was afraid of you, but life has shown me that I was wrong. Today I see that you are a man of worth." Those words stuck with me, because it wasn't just forgiveness from a bakery owner. It was validation from someone who represented the community, someone who had a voice in that neighborhood. It was as if, through him, I had been given a collective second chance. Little by little, the weight of humiliation became fuel. I began to believe that my past didn't have to be my future. I couldn't erase my mistakes, but I could choose not to repeat them. I could, yes, be remembered not as the thief, but as the man who saved a bakery from robbery, who repaired radios, who cycled through the streets with a backpack full of tools and hope. However, the greatest lesson learned was intimate. I discovered that I didn't need to prove anything to everyone. Anyone who wanted to keep calling me a thief, let them. Anyone who preferred to believe rumors rather than what they saw with their own eyes, let them. I no longer had time to convince everyone. What mattered was believing in myself. What mattered was the life I chose to live each day. And that's how I realized. My true freedom began when I stopped trying to be perfect for others and started being honest with myself. Today, when I remember that first time I walked into the bakery and heard the shout, "Thief, go away," I feel pain, of course. It's not something that goes away, but I also feel gratitude, because if I hadn't experienced that humiliation, perhaps I wouldn't have had the chance to show who I really was. Perhaps I wouldn't have had the opportunity to prove, at the most critical moment, that I had changed. Life is made of cycles. The bakery, which was once a symbol of my rejection, became a symbol of my redemption. The same counter where I was thrown out was the counter where I received my second chance. And this contrast is the image I carry with me, the certainty that nothing is written in stone. If someone were to ask me today what I've learned from all this, I would say, I've learned that dignity isn't something you ask for, it's something you earn. I've learned that no matter how low you've fallen, there's always a way to get back up, as long as you want to. I've learned that other people's opinions can hurt, but they should never define who you are. And above all, I learned that true freedom isn't found in open streets or unlocked doors. It's within us, when we can close our eyes and sleep peacefully, knowing we chose right, even when it would have been easier to choose wrong. The last time I closed my bedroom door after a long day of work, my body tired and my heart light, I smiled to myself, because I realized that for the first time in many years, I no longer felt trapped by anything. I was no longer a prisoner of bars, nor of gazes, nor of my own past. I was just Michael, an ordinary man with mistakes, scars, but also with new choices. And when I turned out the light and lay down, I knew I was finally free.